I feel like everybody's right and everybody's wrong.
100%. Why is this important? Why are we even going here? He's helped a lot of guys. He's also not had success with a lot of guys.
Come in with a purpose, and they're very intentional with what they do and how they do it.
From the majors to the sandlot, baseball and softball share space in one place. Welcome to the farm system.
All right. Well, as we talked about off this, again, Randy, obviously we've, been friends now for so many years and a mentor in so many different ways. And not only just from the training philosophy side, but also when it comes into obviously unique background from having more of the PT side. And I'm sure we'll get into a lot of those things as well, and just understanding the body from that lens. And then also from a training perspective of, some of these athletes. And I know, quickly on the other side of that, I'm obviously going to, I kind of wanted you to give us the highlight now as well, is you've done a lot of things. You've been successful with a lot of different areas. Give us kind of our audience. I know you very well, but give them a brief, understanding of who you are and kind of your background and some of that stuff.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm Randy Sullivan. Let's see. I started out as a mediocre baseball player at the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, the only military institution to ever make it to Division I College World Series, by the way.
That's cool.
They did it 4 years after I left, so they had to get some better players. But then after that, I went into the Air Force. I was there on an Air Force ROTC scholarship. I had a reasonable career there. I was not a pitcher, remarkably, I was a catcher. The only thing I knew about pitchers back then was they couldn't get the signs with a run on second base. And otherwise, I didn't know much about it. But I went into the Air Force for 10 years. I became a nuclear missile launch officer. I used to have my hands on the keys to the missiles that would end the world, which is scary. If you know me, that's frightening, especially if you can imagine me at 22 years old. Scary concept, okay? And then I realized that wasn't really my calling, was to sit in a hole in the ground and do nothing for hours on end. And so I had an opportunity to go to physical therapy school while I was in the Air Force. And so I became a physical therapist. Moved to Tampa, got out of the Air Force, opened up a private practice in physical therapy, ran it for almost 30 years with my business partner, Amy Marsh, who you know really well, who is just the HLIC, the head lady in charge that keeps us all out of trouble here.
For sure.
Yeah. And then, and I had a son who was a baseball player. I had 3 boys. They all played ball. And my oldest was a 17-year-old lefty who couldn't get a scholarship because he didn't throw hard enough. And so, every game, played on a really high ranked nationally travel team. Couldn't get anybody to look at him because, he was 79 to 81 miles an hour and nobody was interested. And so we had to figure out how to throw harder. So when I asked everybody in the baseball world I knew, how do you teach someone to throw hard? And they said, well, it's a gift. You can't teach velocity. And I'm like,
got it or you don't, right?
Yeah. I'm like, well, either we got to give up and not play anymore, or I got to realize that I don't really believe that because it's a movement, right? And I thought, well, I'm a physical therapist, but most of my job is teaching people how to move. If I can teach a person who just had a stroke and, to walk again, maybe we can squeeze a couple miles an hour out of my kids. So we just started going down this path, and pretty quickly we realized that the status quo, the way people were saying we should do it, wasn't really working for a lot of people. And so we had to find our own way. And we kind of just dug into a lot of research, independent study, and asking a lot of people in the baseball world, a lot of the experts and gurus around, and kind of put a whole process together. It worked for him. He got better. I was actually coaching travel ball at the time. And so as a physical therapist in the travel ball world, it seems like I was attracting every injured baseball player in the community. And so our practice was overrun with throwing athletes who were hurt. And it kind of came to me that, man, these things that we did to help my son throw harder, it worked, by the way. He went from like 79 to 81 to, after 2 years at junior college, was at 93. And so we're like, okay, we're onto something here. And
especially, I'm sorry not to intervene, but I wanted to give the context at the time. Nowadays, making velo jumps are like kind of known, and you know what, you could do this. But at that time, like you said, it was very like either you have it or you don't. and getting above 90 was a big deal at the time.
Was a big deal.
Was a massive deal. So I just wanted to lay that context because I know the landscape has really changed in the sport. But like at that time, like you're talking about, like getting above 90 was a massive deal, especially with someone that used to throw 79 to 81. Like that's a massive
And,
deal.
yeah, it was like 2007, maybe 2008. And yeah, and you know, Texas Baseball Ranch was big for us. Of course, we went out there and learned a lot from them. And then we just started putting together ideas from everyone really that we could kind of get information from. And back then there were no places like this. Nobody was doing this. Everybody said you couldn't do it. It was, you know, and honestly, just like anything, when you first get into an area around here, you would have thought that we hated babies and wanted puppies to die. You know, we were trying to hurt kids. We're like, come on, man, we're just trying to help some kids get better.
For sure.
So it turned out that the same things we did to help you throw harder kind of helped keep you healthier too.
Yeah.
And so we began on this path, and you know, before long, we were having so much fun doing it that we decided after 27 years to shut down the physical therapy practice and just focus on baseball. And it has been a remarkable ride. You know, you've been a big part of that. Our conversations have been inspirational for sure, and kind of, you know, always what I love to do. I love to be around critical thinkers who look at things, go, well, why do we believe that is so, and is it true? You know, and begin to dig a little deeper. And you're one of those guys who kind of challenges the corporate think, you know, what everybody thinks is the way to go. Sometimes it's right, but sometimes it's, you know, it's off. And so it evolved into this thing called the Florida Baseball Armory, and here we are, man. Now I think it's kind of hard to keep track, but I think we're a little over 500 kids now that couldn't throw 90 before they got here that now can. Yeah. And you know, lots of kids getting college scholarships, and you know, players who have signed almost $30 million in signing bonuses that grew up here, kids trained here, you know. And the cool thing is, Joe, you've seen this too. I love it when they come in here, they're just bright-eyed and hopeful. And there's nothing special about any of them. They're just people. They're just kids, right? They're just here. They walk in the door, and you got to realize everybody has a shot, right? This thing isn't some genetic gift from God. Of course, the genetics tell you where you start, right?
For sure.
But if you're only going to work with genetically gifted kids, then, you know, why coach? That's no fun, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So, you know, our mantra, we have this written on the back of our gym. God doesn't make junk, and human tissue doesn't have free will. I say it every day to our guys, like, look, this is something that isn't some mystery. It's not some, oh my gosh, I was just gifted this as a kid and I'm, you know, I don't have it, so I'm never going to make it, or I do it. It's a movement that is a process that you need to train. And, you know, we never know how far they're going to get, but we know we can make them better. That's for sure. So that's the fun of it, is just the life-changing opportunities that you get, you know, as a coach, as a teacher.
Yeah, no, and I love one of the things too that I've always enjoyed, because a lot of people might think too, because believe me, obviously there's a lot of people in the pitching world, and obviously you guys as well, you know, have again, from not only your guys' off season, all those things, and all that with hitters, right? Like you guys have done all these other things, right? But in the very beginning, obviously when me and you have met, some people might think that our worlds interwebbing would sound a little like off. Like there's a lot of hitting guys that don't talk to like primarily pitching guys or primarily hitting guys, or, you know, all those other things, right? Like, you know, again, I pitched in college. A lot of people don't know this. I was the closer, right, for my team. Like that's literally why I got a D1, a shot at D1, was because I could pitch a little bit. And, you know, I was a two-way, all those other things. And honestly, I was probably a better pitcher than I was a hitter. But I really wanted to hit, and I had a passion for why I couldn't hit, which drove me, you know, that way as well. But also too, one of the things that, like you said, where there was a lot of overlap, is definitely training and what comes into the body, and how like viewing the body from a training lens, I think is like, I always follow a lot of your content when it's like strictly pitching, like, right. It's like, what does that have? Why am I watching, you know, this content, right? And a big part of that is definitely largely how you guys go about training athletes, right? And so one of the things I wanted to kind of bring up was because of that unique background of having a PT as like a base, right? Before getting into some of the stuff, you have a different lens than a lot of people would have as a lens, right? And one of the things I wanted to bring up, which is, it's like funny bringing it up kind of off the top because it was a main thing that I wanted to talk to you about, is first, I wanted to have this conversation with you, but then two, I was like, man, I think that would be such a good conversation for other people to be in on as well. Is, I think there's it's an old thing that's been over time, it's always been a thing inside the space, but also too, there's some new branches on it. And I think there's some dangers with it if we don't kind of look at it. But I think there's this old school, or there's time battle of, okay, do I work with what they got? Or, right? Is it an or is it an and, right? Or, can this get better? Right. And obviously you kind of talked about it as well. Like, okay, it's not either you got it or you don't, but also too, on top of that, where I kind of look at from this other side is, do I work with the asymmetry that they have in their body? Right. And just what they can do and just use that. Right. Or obviously I know from your side of the PT lens, it's like, well, we can change those things. Like, and doesn't mean that every asymmetry needs to get, fixed. It doesn't mean that every,
want to change.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I kind of wanted to open up that conversation because I know that there's also some mixes in the space right now where like sometimes it can be really forced where it's like, doubling down on the asymmetry and just like, we're going to go gung ho, this way down this compensation pattern. And we're just going to try to get it really deep. And then, obviously with some correction. So how do you, from a PT like mindset, like how do you view that stuff of, because I tend to see coaches on the field go, okay, I'm just going to work with the asymmetry, basically the super compensation that they have. That's what we're going to go with. And I'm just going to use them for that. Where on the private side, we see, we kind of get a mix of both. So I kind of wanted to have you open that up and just share your kind of opinion on that view.
Yeah, the first thing is that the cool thing about this is when you really zoom out from the details and you don't worry about the technique so much, movement is the same across the board in all athletics, right? So hitting and pitching, it's the same movement, brother. It is no different. We teach hitters too, and we take the same approach, and it's an anatomical approach. And, not all asymmetries are bad. We don't want to, I think sometimes in the PT world, asymmetries get a little overrated. I think that, okay, we don't need to fix every asymmetry. And it's a lot of times I find that as PTs, we look at things and we're looking for the, aha, that's it. Oh, it's that. Oh, you have GERD. Okay, everybody has GERD a little, right? Glenohumeral internal rotation deficit.
Especially throwers. Yeah.
Give me a pitcher who doesn't, right? And it's not a diagnosis. It's just a variable that's there, right? And it can be addressed. And you don't want a perfectly symmetrical athlete, especially if he's performing at a high level. And the hard part is figuring out what do I accept and what do I need to change? And so we kind of look at it with regard to capacity versus skill, right? I need to build movement capacity. I build that in the gym. I build that on the training room floor. And then I have to translate that into the skill, right? And so I need to have the ability to rotate fast.
Yeah.
And then I need to develop the ability to rotate faster. And then there's a point where, okay, this has to be integrated into skill or it's worthless, right? And spending all your time only working on capacity or all your time only working on skill is a sort of reductionist approach. It's a very narrow pathway. You don't get a lot of transfer that you can actually apply. So I think that it really became helpful as a physical therapist to be able to see anatomy. I think the best thing that PT school did for me to get me ready to do what I do now is just so grounded in anatomy and kind of being able to see through skin and go, what's under there that's moving that way? Like what's causing that movement? And and understanding the fascial network and how that is integrated into the whole process and the complexity of it. I think that so the way I stand on, mobility and symmetry and asymmetry is, first of all, you got to know what you got. You first have to be able to assess and go, this is the landscape, right? There was a time in physical therapy and in performance training that we were told by the experts that having more range of motion was better. Like
Yeah.
if you can, and so we had all these stretching places that emerged, and we're just going to get you more mobility.
Mhm.
And it was either going to make you better or decrease your risk of injury. And after about 10 years of research, peer-reviewed research, that turned out not to be true.
Yeah.
Turns out if we give you too much, we might make it worse. We might either make you worse or get you hurt.
Yeah.
So then the tone shifted to, okay, if you can increase mobility in areas, you're going to be able to get into positions that you couldn't get into before, and therefore enhance or expand your ability, like make your performance better. And it turns out not true so much either. There are a lot of really good athletes, as you know, who are super tight.
Yeah.
And so then for me, it evolved into, okay, with regard to mobility, let's first get a landscape of what we got. It allows us, if we understand how the athlete is made and what his current status is, then it gives us a landscape to say, okay, he should be moving in a way that maximizes or optimizes the landscape of hardware that he has.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be working against ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so by understanding that, it paints a picture of
you-
how we can
yeah.
link the hardware to the software.
Yeah. I was gonna have you unpack that because I know and I love how you break this down. I think it's a great way to think about the body. I use it all the time. I steal it all the time. Can you explain how you view hardware and software so that someone that's listening can understand what you mean by that? Yeah.
Yeah. So hardware, the physical structure is how you're made. It's what you have. Okay. Software is how your body's choosing to move. Some of the hardware we can change.
Yeah.
If you have tight hamstrings, we can stretch them and make them looser, right?
Yeah.
Tight quads, you can stretch them and make them looser. And then some of the hardware you cannot change. For example, the orientation of your hips. Some of us have hips that point outward, called retroverted, meaning that we stand with our feet open, we walk like a penguin, and we sit crisscross applesauce, and we prefer external rotation.
Mm.
And others like me, I'm severely anteverted, I'm pigeon-toed.
Yeah.
And so I stand around with my legs crossed and prefer to W sit than crisscross sit, and so my body prefers internal rotation. And so, for example, as a pitcher, as an anteverted pitcher, I can afford to step across my body a little bit and still have internal rotation on the lead hip to get around without super compensation without a massive compensation to get the ball to home plate. Whereas a guy with different hardware might get stuck, and now he's fighting against himself and creating shear forces that he doesn't need to create and leaking energy.
Yeah.
And so linking the hardware to the software is really critical. Like, you got to understand. So first is understand what you got, like what's the landscape. You have to have a process for doing that. And then change what you can, and then work with what you have. Like, make the body move in a way that optimizes what you have. The hardware changes, it should be noted. If you're going to change hardware, you better change it gradually.
Yeah.
And you take your time.
That's great.
And go slow. Because if you don't, then you may give a person range of motion that they have no motor control of, and now we're at risk. So hardware changes are slow and they take a long time. And so, and it's a good thing that they progress slowly, because
Agreed.
then you can really be discerning about, like, what do we want to change and what doesn't need to change, and that's sort of the key part of the coach's job, is trying to figure out, okay, this is what we have.
Yeah.
Is it worth changing? And what do we think the outcome is going to be when we do? And, I know you see that in hitters too.
Yeah.
Like,
I'm interested with this too as well. When we look at like hardware and we look at some of these changes. So like, let's say, somebody's, anteriorly, like really tipped with their pelvis and pushed forward. Like, let's get like a complex thing, right? Let's say someone's anteriorly tipped forward, their pelvis is pressed forward, and then they have an asymmetry where the right side's more pulled down than the left or something like that, right? So again, I know that was like for somebody listening, they're like, what the hell are you talking about? A little bit more complex. But what I'm doing is I'm leading towards another question with this, right? Like, for example, with that, when we look at that, right, and you see that within a player, and maybe that's limiting them from getting that IR in their back hip, but they have a ton of it in their front hip, right? Or they have, a bunch of ER in their back hip, but they're limited in the front hip, or because of an asymmetry or something going on with their pelvis. And I know that you're big talking about how the pelvis is the center of the universe, right? All these things now compensate based on what's going on with the pelvis, right? So when you look at that and we talk about hardware and we talk about these changes, right? Specifically, is that for you, again, are you looking at that from a base of, I can change that, right? Because I'm interested in your PT brain compared to like training wise, or generally, are you trying to work with that hardware, or how do you see compensations like that or asymmetries in the pelvis like that? And like, how would you view that about when you go about training it?
Yeah, that's a tough call because the body can find stability anywhere.
Anywhere. Yeah.
It doesn't need to be perfect to find stability, right?
Yeah, that's
Thank
great.
God, because if it didn't, we would only be able to do things one way, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing I think that we look for is, with regard to anatomy, to be the most efficient, we need joints that are centered. Like the bones don't need to be shearing across each other.
Yeah.
And then the surrounding musculature needs to be at or near its optimal length, right? Every muscle has a length in which it works the best. Your biceps are weak here because they're too long and weak here because they're too short, but in the middle, they're strong.
Yeah.
And it turns out when you look at anatomy that when joints are centered, the surrounding muscles are usually near their optimal length. Okay, so keeping joint interfaces centered is really important, but you can find stability even when you're on the edges. So imagine you're fooled by a breaking ball and you're out over your front foot and you're leaning across the plate.
Yeah.
If everything had to be perfect, you would never be able to hit a pitch like that.
Yeah.
But because we can find stability through isometrics, really by stabilizing our body, finding co-contraction muscles, then we can find stability even when we're not perfect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we need to be able to do that because it's not always going to be perfect.
Yeah.
I have this theory that if you want to optimize performance, especially in pitching, because it's less variability in the skill than it is in hitting, right?
Yeah.
With the variability is less, that the further you get away from true anatomical optimal length of a muscle,
Yeah.
more difficult it becomes, but not impossible to find stability.
Agreed.
I think of it like a skater on the edge of the skates. Like, how far can they get and still bring it back, right? How far can we get away? And sometimes people get really good at being away from optimal length. The trouble is oftentimes when the muscles are challenged beyond their optimal length, we tend to lean more on passive tissues, which in high intensity events of repetitive nature can become unsustainable.
Yeah.
And
Especially like you mentioned, specifically when you look into like pitchers and things like that, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the rotation degrees per second is the fastest in all sports.
Any movement in all human sport, yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Which obviously you have a tendency, which is why for a really long time when they would look at biomechanical data and they would say there's this correlation between speed and injury, because you definitely have more potential for injury when you're creating more force, like undoubtedly, for sure. But it doesn't mean just because I am throwing harder that I also am going to hurt more. Like it's not like a direct one-to-one, which is what was being argued for a while, inside biomechanics, right? But
right. And what I've just completed this 140,000 word book where you're putting the illustrations in. I'm working with Franz Bosch with this thing. It's inner workings of the anatomy, what's happening at this high speed. And it turns out that, pitching and hitting both begin as a low intensity movement.
Yeah.
And then basically when the front foot hits the ground, it becomes high intensity.
Agreed.
So there are a lot of things you can do in the beginning, in the low intensity portion, that may be perceived as errors. That this technique or style that can be corrected. But then as the speed of the movement intensifies, the options for correction funnel. And I'm convinced that when we get out here to the point where we let go of the ball at release, that collision is sort of unavoidable. It's going to happen. And we have very few options once the movement intensifies in speed. The options for adjustment become less and less and less.
Yes.
And so,
Mhm.
and so we need to appreciate that and understand that first of all, we have to, if you're leaning on passive tissues repetitively over and over and over again,
Yeah.
if a guy constantly lets go of his bat and shears the shoulder and stresses the labrum without continuing to support it with his body,
Mhm.
over time, you take enough swings, you're looking at a labrum issue or shoulder issue. Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Or Miguel Cabrera when he tore his bicep on
Tore his
a swing
bicep,
like that.
exactly.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because you're just no longer, the muscles are no longer able to support and provide stability. And now things like ligaments and labrums and fascia and things like that have to do the job.
Yeah.
And over time, that's not sustainable. And, you know, in a one-off event, maybe, but when you have to repeat it 120 times a day,
Mhm.
not sustainable.
Do,
So
do you look at when you specifically, again, going deeper into that and unpacking specifically that, one of the things that I think is pretty interesting and a lot of people don't necessarily view it from this lens, right? Is like when you have a typical injury, like a lot of times, like you said, there it's mostly soft tissue generally. Like I'm, you know, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but like on the same side of that, I was looking at that, like again, for example, when you look at like the fascial system, a lot of times when people have strains and these other things, it's like you're having a lot of that soft tissue, let it be with that. And a lot of people, you know, think like, oh, I popped my hamstring, and they're thinking like they like tore the actual like hamstring, rather than a lot of times it is that connective tissue or that soft tissue that's in there. And that's what, you know, from my experience, but again, I know you have a different lens just from the PT side, but would you tend to agree with that? Or, you know, what is that, that view for you?
well, first of all, there's a lot of really progressive anatomists now that think that the way they painted the pictures in the book
Yeah.
isn't anything what it looks like. Like
Yeah.
it's hard to know the difference between fascia and the ligament or the tendon or the muscle. You know, it's just like I remember when we when I was in PT school, we dissected a cadaver, and you know, we went to the UCL. We got to the UCL, and they go, okay, we had to put these little flags in it to pass the test. And I mean, we're cutting this thing open, and we're just really inside. We're just this giant web of strings and fascia, and
Yeah.
you know, all the way down to the microscopic level.
Mm-hmm.
The structures aren't as clear and as delineated as they paint them in the book, right?
Yeah.
And so I looked at this elbow, and I'm supposed to put a pin in the UCL, and I'm like, wow, that looks like just a web of stuff, right?
There's like
And
60
so-
things that are connected right now, like, or a billion things that are all connected in an inner
And
web that looks like a web.
and
Yeah.
So what I did is I looked at the drawing, and I took my scalpel and I carved out a segment of tissue that looked just like the UCL and stabbed it with a pin. Got an A test. It's not that, it's not that clear, you know, it's not that
Yes.
defined.
No, it
And
makes
so every time you tear, if you pull a muscle, you tear fibers of the muscle,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so we're just this infinite web of connective tissue that kind of blends together.
Mhm.
And it's these fascial connections, these strings that we call slack, right?
Mhm.
When there's slack in the system, then the muscles can't coordinate and cooperate very well. But when everything's working together and the slack is taken up, now those fascial strings become the communication system, and the body operates on pressure gradients to try to maintain the integrity of the structure, right? So if there's compressive force here, a muscle will fire to provide tension to stabilize it. If there's tensile force that becomes too much, this muscle will compress to keep the slack standardized, right?
Yeah.
And so, and that's what people call biotensegrity. And that's the whole system we operate on, is the body's just outside of conscious control. The body's just trying to keep everything coordinated and organized so that there's no slack in the system, because when there's slack, structures get left alone without support of the entire structure.
Yeah.
And so,
I love it.
and so like when you hit like a hitter, an oblique muscle, right?
Yeah.
We just didn't regulate slack very well there, you
Mhm.
know, while we're rotating. a portion of the system was exposed to slack, and it left another segment vulnerable, and a muscle or the fibers around the muscle or even the soft tissue that connects to it, the fascial slings, just ripped and
Yeah.
have to heal.
I think you make a great again, like you said, with that, right, is seeing those things, like, for example, like, and I know that you're big with this when it comes into, like, the site of pain, right? Like, okay, it was my left side, my oblique, my outer oblique, it pops, right, and everybody immediately goes to that area, right? But like you said, like, there's so much bigger to this, right, where it's like you said, the root of this, of having like a book, right? We learn all these things in pieces. So what do we do to nature, right? We grab nature, we break it into pieces so I can understand it, right? I put it in, I go to nature and I create all these sciences, and I have geology and I have biology, and I have, and I go through all of these sciences, but nature doesn't know science, right? Science is what we've created to understand nature. So when we go inside the body, like you're talking about too as well, it's like there's all these intermixing of not only systems that are all interplaying, but it's also nature, right? And so I think a lot of times when we get into kinesiology and biology and physiology, and like we break it into all these separate sciences, but the body doesn't know these separate sciences, right? It's all of this intermixing of this entire thing, which is beautiful to me. And I know fellow nerds like with it, like really, it's so beautiful. And I can see the intricacies of, just God's work. And again, just like how amazing we are as creatures, that we're able to be so adaptable and be able to, do all these things that we can do. But also too, I think the problem, like you said, is that we take all these things into pieces, but we don't put them back together again. And we start to look at them from just pieces, and it's not, it's one thing, it isn't just, again, obviously that one muscle, right, that's attached from here to here, and like, that's it, right? And it doesn't look like what you said. Like on the book, I go and look at, and I'm so with you. And I talk about this all the time. And it's like, man, like if you don't go study anatomy and you don't go past 100 anatomy and go, oh, this is my bicep and this is my like, if you don't go past these basics of anatomy, when you go to coach, I mean, you're kind of coaching blind, and then, and if you don't assess and you don't know what their body can do. And it doesn't mean that, everything needs to be a table test and you need to be a PT and you need to do all these other things. But if you don't look at movement and you just really get to that reductionist approach where you just go and you don't have an appreciation for movement quality, and you just go down, either you have it or you don't, and this guy throws hard or he doesn't. And then, like you said, you have all these injuries and, all these other things that can really pop up. But I think the big thing, like I said, that I really wanted to point to with there as well, is one of the things that's also generally missed is once you have all these things with the body, well, you also have what you talk about as the software. It's like the technique piece, right? Where it's like, I might just be putting my body in really bad positions, that can cause some really, bad issues. Like, again, I popped my oblique 5 times. There's probably something going on. Like, I tore my ACL 3 times. There's probably something going on, that like technique wise, or what I'm trying to do, the task, how I'm trying to do it. And, I see that a lot,
Yeah. And the technique, you can get lost a little bit because of mechanics, right?
Agreed.
Everybody's looking at mechanics and okay, it's a mechanical issue. All injuries for pitching are attributed to mechanics. And the body can do it a lot of different ways, right?
But only so many ways.
I know. And so I think of it as like the over the course of your life, every swing you've taken, every throw you've made, your body has laid down these navigational beacons that provide a pathway through it. If not, you would swing different or throw different every time, right?
Yeah.
But they organize into a pattern, right? And so I think of these beacons as the pelvis, the abdominal, the shoulder, the elbow, and then deceleration. And over time, your body has learned to go down these paths, right? And then every time you make a repetition of a swing or a throw, your body compares the intended outcome to what the status of those beacons was. And then it begins to recalibrate and kind of solidifies them and go, I'm better when I go down here. Now, like, so if you zoom out from the details of mechanics and technique and just kind of rally around these what we call the big rocks and not the pebbles, right?
Mm.
The big rocks are the same in hitting and throwing and fielding, and also people who you think are outliers in technique or mechanics.
Yeah.
If you really zoom out, you go, look, their pelvis is in a good place. Their abdominals are really synergized, co-contracted. Their shoulders are in a good place. And so the beacons are all there, and they are able to organize that, right? Even though it looks different, the technique looks different.
For sure.
They're self-organizing a lot of different ways to an endpoint
Yes.
that has to be stable. And so for me, the reason the pelvis is so central is that that's the transition between low intensity to high intensity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I need to have a stable platform. I need to control that to be able to launch the high intensity stuff off the top of it. And so, I think that I just wrote this ebook that I sent out called Dead Guys and Robots, right? And
Typical Randy title.
Dead Guys and Robots. Here's the thing. We're trying to solve the injury problem in pitching, especially with biomechanics and, and we look at, like, they say that a UCL can tear at 35 Newton meters of torque, and it has to accept 70 Newton meters of torque during a pitch.
Yeah.
But the truth is, Joey, no one really knows how much torque a UCL can take.
Yeah.
Because the studies where we got the information were done with cadavers, dead guys.
So
we don't really know. And we think that it needs to accept 70 Newton meters because we put motion capture sensors on an arm, and we had a bunch of people throw, and we said it has to accept an average of 70 Newton meters. But the problem with that is that the motion capture sensors tell us what the sensors are doing.
Yeah.
And we make inferential leap that that's what's happening in the body.
Yeah.
Intricate of internal microscopic muscle contractions that organize the body that we can't account for, right? And so the body doesn't adhere to the laws of Newtonian physics, right? It's the sensors, right? And so we assume we got the 70 Newton meters off of robots, and we got the 35 off dead guys. We don't know really, okay? We don't know how much it has to take. So we think we have all this great information because of all of this technology we can use to measure things, but we don't really know the internal self-organization that's going on. And we're centuries away from being able to actually quantify that, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to appreciate that all the data we have is good. It's important to begin to continue to go down that road. But we always make that mistake that I kind of quote Robert McNamara on from the Vietnam War era. When you can't measure what's important, you tend to make what you can measure seem more important than it is.
Agreed.
And so, like when you teach a hitter, you're not teaching him or her a swing. You're teaching a movement pattern that navigates through these beacons.
Yeah.
Then they can use to adapt to any situation necessary.
Yeah, and everybody has their own variation of and that's what I mean. And I'm glad you brought that up when it comes to like technique, because literally, like you talked about, right? It's like, again, I got hitters that start with their hands over their head, and hitters that are super crouched, and hitters that are super wide and super narrow, and one hand finishes and two hand finishes, and all of these variables, and more posture, less posture. This guy's the pelvis is more tilted, so he's got to stand. When he stands more up, it kind of tucks his hips a little bit more underneath him, or like there's all of these little variations of things, right? And but also, with that being said, as well, is like you mentioned, right, is that the best in the world do things, right, that an amateur generally, doesn't get to, or X, Y, and Z along with it. Now, again, does that mean that you need to do this exact movement and all those other things? No, right? But
you have to be careful with that, right? You have to be careful with that, because the best in the world, there's some fundamental things they do.
Yes.
It has nothing to do with technique. It has nothing to do with technique. It's like when somebody says the best in the world do this, I go, not really. I can show you 30 guys who do that same thing that suck royally. And I can show you that guy doing it 30 different ways, right? But if you zoom out from the details and just look at these big fundamental big rocks, then they all do those things well. Yeah.
Yeah,
You're
yeah,
right.
yeah, and that's what I mean by that. Like for
Yeah.
specifically, some people can get that out of context. Like for example, like the decel patterns of a really elite athletes are, very sharp. They accelerate really sharp, they decel really sharp. When I see an amateur, you're gonna have more of like a rolling hill, right? Which is
Right.
like, again, like, or for example, like you mentioned, a lot of people don't understand that because it's commonly taught at youth levels. When they talk about the pelvis, they want that to be the high intensity, right? They want the
Right.
high intensity to be how hard can I spin my pelvis,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And that becomes problematic when you don't view the body as like you said, it's like, I almost look at it like, I give the example of like a merry-go-round, right? A merry-go-round, right? Well, the middle and also it's anchored to the floor, and if it's not anchored to the floor, you can't spin fast up top, right? If that thing started wobbling,
Right.
you're moving, right? Like you need that lower body stability in those co-contractions, and all that is super important, right? And so, and obviously at youth levels, like one of the first things that we did when we first, our first course, I called it Essentials of Hitting, right? And my thought process was, well, the biggest chasm you have is expert trainers compared to an amateur, novice, volunteer coach at a little league or something like that, right? And so, he sees these little kids not rotating their feet. So what's the first thing that he says? Oh, squish the bug. You got to rotate your backside, right? And then all these things, it can happen, right? And so I was like, how do I close that gap between, in the world today, it's a lot easier, right? I don't know about you, Randy, but I didn't have access to hitting coordinators and all these things, all the expert information. Now it's like, man, we can really get this information from top to bottom pretty easy with social media nowadays.
Yeah.
Like we didn't have
Yeah.
access. I would have loved to have access to somebody like you when I was coming up through college or, high school or any of the things when I was throwing, right? I was going by the seat of my pants, and Twitter, don't get me wrong, it was there, but I mean, it wasn't anywhere like where things are now, social media wise, to find guys. And so I do think, like you said, it becomes such a big thing for people to understand, even if it's just some basic things like, hey, if you just, the body actually like, kids have some really good movements. And I think I wanted to point that out for what you're saying too, Randy, is I think a lot of times another mistake that we can make is that like, well, elite athletes move really well and kids need to learn to move really well. But, as
Yeah.
that's not always that, and largely isn't the case. We actually can get messed up in between those two. Movement quality can be really good for a kid, right? And then, and again, really good for an elite athlete, but a lot of times the in between, and it kind of led me into this thing I wanted to bring up to you because I see it happen a ton. And I know that obviously with you training, how you train, I know that this probably is a topic for you as well. One of the things that I see, so let's say you train this kid over the whole summer, all the things, right? He's okay, remote training, he's with you, he's on Savage, right? All the things, right? He's doing his thing, right? You're like, oh, awesome, right? But then he goes back to school, right? And then the school coach has their strength program that is for everybody on the team, but for that guy, right? For example, all of a sudden he starts having all these movement issues, right? He starts having all these problems. And what I've seen a lot of times, and again, I know as always, no coach is trying to make somebody worse. Never, right? It's never the process, right? So do you see what I see, which I see a lot of times that our players, they go back to school and man, they crush for like the first 2 months or, all these things. And they come back for break and then, we do our training again and we get all these things and we get them really dialed in. They go back and then they crush for, another 2 months. And then all of a sudden they start having some of these movement things. And obviously there's variables in there, but I think a large part as well. I'm interested to see if you see some of that with, again, how you're training and how it impacts your performance directly on the field.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time educating our players on their process. This is what you do, and this is why. People say I give them too much information, but I don't think so. I think they're smarter than we give them credit for, right?
Yeah.
And I got to teach you at least a foundational understanding of your process, our process that we call Savage training, for 2 reasons. Number one, I need to improve the quality of your filter, your BS meter.
Mhm.
so that you don't get lost and distracted with every Yahoo. You
Yep.
know, I call him the all you gotta do guy. All you gotta do is just right here and you'll throw it, and all you gotta do, right? And so I need to be able to filter out the all you gotta do guy who's trying to help, but has incomplete information.
Yeah.
And then I also need to make you what Nassim Taleb called anti-fragile, right? Unmess upable,
Mhm.
right? When kids, that used to happen to us all the time. Kids would do really well with us. They'd go away, start their season. They'd come back, tell me how your season went. Well, it's going good. And then my coach made me do this and it messed me up. And I'm like, I used to be like, oh man, I'm so sorry that happened. Oh,
Mhm.
bad. And now I'm like, that's your fault, brother. That's
Yeah,
your
yeah.
fault.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
got to be so good at what you do that you are unmess upable, that no one can mess you up, that
Mhm.
you could report to your first practice as a hitter and say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to have you stand on your head and swing the bat with your feet for 3 weeks. And you could be like, well, all right, let's do that. And
Mhm.
then when practice is over, you got to
Yep.
go home and
Yep.
your practice begins when practice ends, right?
Yep. Yep.
Practice begins. Nobody gets better at team practice. We're there to make the lineup. Okay. We get better on our own time, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so your practice has to begin, and you have to know these are the things that I have to do to get myself ready to play so that when it comes time to perform, I can perform, because every coach is trying to help. Every coach plays their favorites.
Yep.
Your job is to be their favorite. How do you be their favorite? You win the game.
Mhm.
You win the game. They get paid and feed their kids when you win the game. And coaches will play you not based on your compliance, but based on your performance.
Mhm.
We all want you to comply. We want you to do what I tell you to do. But if you comply and you suck, you don't play.
Mhm.
So you have to go home. You have to go, okay, I am doing everything that they tell me to do in the weight room here. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do here.
Yeah.
And I'm so used to doing things with a lot of variability that won't mess me up, because I'm going to go home, I'm going to get my water bag out, and I'm going to be in my dorm room and do my stuff. And then
Yeah.
I'm going to get ready to go perform, right?
Amen.
And then when my team makes super regional because I threw a complete game shutout and they're asking me on the interview, like, hey man, how'd you get so good? Or,
Mhm.
if we hadn't been standing on our head and swinging the bat with our feet, we wouldn't have been any good at all.
Yep.
Even if it's not true, you have to learn to thrive, not just survive, thrive in that environment where people are hitting you with information and you have to be able to filter it out. And then you have to know, this is what I do to get better.
Yep.
And I'm going to go take what I do and get better. And they have to become their own coach. We have to give them the tools to know. And then, of course, they're not experts yet. So we're there. Give us a call. Tell me what you got to do. And we'll tell you how we can work around and within that construct. That's really tough to navigate, though, especially for the younger they are, if
Yeah.
they're not really.
One of the things, yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. It's also really hard for like freshmen, especially if they're on a big program their first year, it's difficult. Totally get it. And we have a lot of those similar conversations as teaching them, like, again, hey, your coach comes to you and says this, what does that mean to you? Because it doesn't mean that their eyes are wrong. How
Right.
they might have gone about fixing it might not have been in the way that I would recommend, but they see your barrel dragging. They see you, they see you doing these things, right? So like, how do you interpret that? And what does that mean to you? And what are you typically doing when you're doing X, right? What's typically going on, right? And it kind of led me to this other question though, for you, going back to some of the hardware stuff. And like you said, one of the things that I've noticed, and tell me if you notice this as well, and this is where I did this presentation this year at Alliance for softball, and I was going through the evolution of training for baseball players, right? And I was going through the different eras and what happened, right? So we had the era, right? And I pulled up all the quotes, and whereas like, dude, they were fining people for working out or swimming. Like, if you work out or swim, you're getting a fine, right? We don't go in the weight room. We don't even have a weight room. It don't work out, right? So you had that era. Then you got into an era where it was like, obviously too, and I progressed through them, skipping some steps, but you get to the steroid era where it's like, all right, everybody's just injecting, getting huge, all these other things. And I felt like for baseball, that kind of got us off track, which it showed some value in having strength and what could happen from that side. But it kind of got us deviated where we started being like football players and we started training like bodybuilders, and everybody kind of started going that direction. And I think that we've corrected and we came back a lot more. But, and from what I've seen, is that softball is really behind, where they're still kind of in that same area where largely, again, the strength coaches and the things that, and the resources that they're getting, even at some of the highest levels of the sport, are a lot of programs. I mean, and I know that you see a lot of these programs and stuff too. Like, I think some people would be shocked at some of the programming at like bigger colleges that, we're not going to name, but some bigger colleges that you'd be like, man, like, the programming here it's not as advanced as I would think, like you would see in some other places, right? So what I was going back to that hardware thing, right? Like, let's say, for example, you have some, like, kind of like what I mentioned earlier, right? You got somebody with some major compensation, super compensation, some of the things that they've done with some asymmetries in their pelvis, right? They're anteriorly tilted. They got an asymmetry where the right side's pulled down, like, a little bit more. They're, the right shoulders drop, right, right hips up, all these things, right? And then now I'm loading that pattern with 400 pounds on my back, and I'm squatting it over and over and over and over again. We're not staggering our feet. We're not doing any variations of that, right? And so now that compensation's gotten dramatically from year one as a freshman to, let's add a redshirt year, and let's go up to, my fourth or fifth year, right? Like, now I have some really big challenges to overcome because of how I see the body adapt to how you're training it, right? Do you see that from that lens? And I know, like I said, I'm just interested in like how you see that from, again, training. Like, okay, yes, I do what they tell me to do in practice, but what they're doing in practice, let's say specifically in a weight room, right, is when I'm loading when I'm loading something with 400 pounds or 300 pounds or these massive weights, that the body does adapt, right? It doesn't have free will, right? As you mentioned, right? It adapts to what you're making it do. And kind of how do you battle back against things like that, where, like, yeah, I have my water bag in the weight room and I do those other things, but also too, what I'm doing in the weight room really is starting to cause some issues.
Yeah, look, I get it. There is value to strength. No one can argue that. Okay.
For sure.
But there's also return on training time, right? That's,
Mhm.
At worst, why am I wasting all this time when lifting this much is enough, right?
Yeah.
I didn't need more. I needed enough, right?
Yeah.
But then, when you're not loaded in an event like a game, like a pitch or a swing, when you don't have the bar on your neck, see, when you overtrain with heavy loads, you teach the body to find stability through just because the weight is on there, and you don't learn to use co-contractions to stabilize.
So good. Yeah. Agreed.
It can have, over time, it can have a negative effect that you lean too much on, I need to have a load to be able to find stability. And in the game, I'm not loaded. They don't let me take them out to the mound.
Can you say that again? I need to have that part.
So when you overtrain with heavy loads, you teach the body to find stability only when it's loaded. In the game, you're not loaded. They don't let you take the bar out to the mound and then drop it, make a pitch, take the bar out to home plate, drop it, make a swing. Yeah. And so you have to learn to find stability when you're not loaded, right? And if you overtrain in a really heavy loaded situation, aside from the rate of force development problem that you don't learn to create force fast enough, you learn to find stability only when loaded, and you can't recruit isometric co-contractions internally to help you find stability. And so it kind of robs you of that ability to find stability when it's not a loaded and when you're in a high intensity situation. Yeah. And so what we have to get our guys to do is use other modalities. Like the reason the water bags work so well is because when the load is unstable and unpredictable, the only way for the body to find stability is through isometric co-contractions. Okay. Yeah. So that's why they're not overly loaded. They're not heavy, right? Yeah. But the perturbations cause little internal microscopic muscles to co-contract and coordinate and stabilize with each other. Now that is stability that I can use in a high intensity, in the context of a high intensity event, right?
Yes.
And so we need a little bit of both, right? We need, and so think about unstable loads. When the body's exposed to an unstable load, an unpredictable load, it reverts to its reflex of isometrics, right? And you have to control stability in high intensity movements with isometrics, not total body Arnold Schwarzeneggers. I'm talking like little microscopic dudes that flex and hit off to one another, like little synchronized movements, like, right?
Yep.
When the load is unstable, I always say, like, think about a surfer. The stimulus is unpredictable, and so they have to control it with isometrics.
Yeah.
Think about if you've ever held a squirming baby or caught a big fish or in a roller coaster, the stimulus was unpredictable, so you had to control it with isometrics.
Yeah.
And so by using instability as the load instead of weight, we kind of invite the body to go, hey, dude, like, learn to find stability with co-contraction instead of while you're under heavy load. Another way that you can learn to remove slack, because you remove slack with isometrics. Isometrics take the slack out of the system. You do its counter movements. And so if we train a lot of counter movements, like if we have to go back to go forward, or we have to take the elastic out like a rubber band.
Yeah.
The problem is you don't learn to take out slack with isometrics, and in a game, there's no time for counter movements. You don't have time to go back to go forward as a hitter.
Yeah.
Right. A basketball rebounder with a great vertical leap. It always amazes me. They do these counter movement jumps to test athleticism. You know, how high can I jump? Well,
yeah.
You might have the greatest vertical leap in the world, but if you have to take a counter movement to go down to go up, you're never going to get a rebound because the ball went off the rim. Right? There's no time for counter movements. And in baseball and hitting, especially, we don't have time to take slack out with counter movements. Okay. In the low intensity phase, maybe a little.
Yeah, I'll say, yeah, not solely with a counter. Like you might have some counter, but like, as you mentioned, you need to have that co-contraction.
But think about this. Even if you use a counter movement, you think of a counter movement as stretching the rubber band, right? Something's got to anchor the rubber band. If you stretch a rubber band, it doesn't stretch. There's no slack taken out. You got to anchor it with an isometric, and then you can stretch it, right?
Yes.
And so you need to learn to use co-contractions to take slack out of the system. And I think that one of the problems in the weight room is if we get too lost in heavy loads, we teach the body to find stability without using co-contractions.
Or isolating too. I've seen this happen in certain weight rooms, right? Where they got machines and they're doing all these things of isolating. It's like, again, right? You take all that away. There isn't any instability, or generally not any instability, right? So it's like predictable loads, or you're isolating a muscle group to not work in tandem with the rest of the system. And again, you're training and I think we empirically know this, right? Like, for example, if you stand on the field and a guy walked in the field and he looked like a bodybuilder, you'd be like, probably not my shortstop. Like if a guy walked in and he was that muscle bound, like we say we want size, we say we want all those other things, but also too, we know with our eyes when a guy walks in, if he looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger when he walked on the field and he looked like a bodybuilder, you'd be like, we know that in general, we've had enough athletes that have even gone that direction that obviously there's something there. Now, does that mean that the eye test is always correct? Like, no, I want to see the guy move, right? But what I mean by that though, is like, I think that we know that when guys train a certain way, because I see it on social media all the time where a lot of times people are giving advice to some of these high school athletes and things like that. And they're like, you need to put on size, you need to put on size, you need to put on size, you need to put on size. And it's just like, yeah, but he was a better player when he was 20 pounds lighter. And it's not about just putting on size. I'm not against putting on size, but what I am on the other way, that it's like how we put on size or how we create speed or how we create athleticism and how we train does matter. And how we acquire it is something that we should pay attention to and not be like cavemen. And it's like, I pick up heavy weight, I put it down, I swing bat club hard and hit ball. It's just much more advanced than that. Like we don't train that way,
Right. And I always, for a younger guy, putting on weight is good, right? Like in our big, massive Newton force study we did, the number one influence of velocity in a pitcher was weight. Mass is equal to gas.
Yeah.
But only up to 180 pounds. after 180, it didn't matter if you were 190 or 200 or 220, it didn't matter. You had to be big enough, right?
Big enough.
And so for a lot of 140-pound high school kids,
Yeah.
the road to 85 is a set of dumbbells and a Chipotle gift card. You know, you know, let's just get a little bigger. And one of the reasons that we still integrate, you know, traditional weightlifting in our weight room.
Sure. Same.
Because there's value to a certain, but second of all, they need to learn to protect themselves when they get to college because they're going to be asked to do it.
Yep.
And we tell our guys, please don't ever be the leaderboard guy in the weight room.
Yeah.
Just don't, like, that guy's never the MVP. He's never the MVP.
For sure. Hey, you're looking at one right here, baby.
I was the king of false hustle, bro. I was the king. You want a 6-minute mile to make the team? I'll run it in 5:05. Didn't matter.
I was, you know, as you know, we've talked about before, is I was the deadlift guy. I was the squat guy, like sagittal plane. I destroyed it. Like I could. I personally experienced your strength. Yes. You're a strong dude. You're a strong dude. Yeah. So, but they do need to learn because there's value to it. Second of all, they're going to have to do it when they get to college. So don't be the guy who shows up unable. And then the strength coach puts you on some remedial program or thinks that you're weak and the word gets around that you're soft. Yeah.
And also learn to protect yourself. Like, look, get to a point where you're like, hey man, that's all the weight I can do. I want you to be above average.
Yeah.
Be above average. But don't be a leaderboard. Don't chase your maxes there. If we're going to get hurt, let's get hurt doing the skill.
Yep.
Right. And then, and also you need to look better in the uniform because the people that make decisions about next level opportunities think that you need to look a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to fill out the jersey.
Yeah.
Otherwise you have to overcome it with some elite performance. Okay. So take it for what it's worth, but be better, be good enough with that, right? Be good enough.
Yeah.
And value to it. There's value. Overindulgence can have negative training effects for sure.
Yeah. And, you know, there has been a lot more things coming out, you know, and then also we have examples of this, right? Like, for example, like Mookie Betts has been a little bit more outspoken with like what he does and like has his own vlogs and stuff like that. So he did one recently where he was in the weight room and he's like, you know, puts a 45 on each side of the bar and he goes to do squats and he's like, yeah, this is the most I do. I never do more than this. Right. And if you look and you're like, think about elite athleticism, you'd be like, what? Like, you know, but again, obviously he's already at, you know, that level too, as well. Like you said, it's not like he's in high school and like, that's the most amount. And that doesn't mean that that's the most amount of weight he can do. Right.
No,
it just, he's choosing not to, you know, for a plethora
of
reasons.
Major leaguers shorten their career. Like,
yeah,
because they just crushed their body for so long, for so many years, year after year after year. Like, at what point is this enough? At what point do I not need to add weight to the bar? Yeah. You know, it's a big paradigm shift. We made a big breakthrough with our training when we began to realize that if the way you make a system adapt is to load it, right? You have to load it.
Yeah.
Right. But when you begin to think of load as something other than just weight.
Yeah.
If you think of instability or variability or as load. Yeah. Now you can still get a training effect. You can still get an adaptation.
Yes.
Without having to beat the body down with load. We get lost in this idea that load means weight.
Yes.
Load means unpredictable, different, unique. It means challenging, but not always.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think a better way of another way of saying it is almost like stress or stimulus, right? Like if we look at it that way, you know,
it doesn't have to equal weight. Yeah, you don't have to keep adding weight to the bar, right?
Yes.
Or you can think of it as complexity of movement, right? Like,
yep.
When we progress our exercise, a lot of times it's like, okay, I need to make this exercise more complex to advance it, or regress it because this guy's getting bodied on every rep. Mm-hmm. We can just decrease the complexity. Take the rotational component out of it. Do just a sagittal plane movement without a rotation, and then add a rotation.
Well, and literally, like you're saying, and then the other thing I wanted to bring up as well from some of the martial arts and some of the things that I've done from my background is like another way I think it's interesting to think about strength, right? Is like, it's all relative to like, obviously the task and the things that I'm doing. Like, you know, if you do jujitsu and you walk up and this guy is like, You know, he looks like he's, you know, paper. He's thin, he's long, he's limber, all those things. And then the guy grabs you. And when he grabs you, they call it match strength, right? When that guy grabs you and you can't get away, and you feel how the control and the stability he has, and how he uses his whole body, it's like, man, that's a different type of strength. Is it, you know, again, can he go in the weight room?
Oh, yeah. Oh God, it'd be my worst nightmare. Yeah.
So that's my worst nightmare.
I can't get away from this guy. I don't know what I do.
Yeah, and also too, jiu-jitsu, obviously, specifically, now we're going down that route, is it's so technique driven that they use your own momentum and strength against you. And so almost like the same thing too is like, I think about this, right? Is like, if that guy, and I've seen them, they go in the weight room, he might not be able to lift more than 300 pounds in a squat. He might not have 250 in a squat, right? But man, like, and I might be able to do way more than him and all these, but it's like specific. And again, I know that it's gotten really watered down when it comes to like, when we say specific strength, but in reality, if we're not training for where we're trying to perform, then what are we training for? You know,
Yeah.
and it does need to be more specific. I'm not training to be a bodybuilder. So why am I training to be a bodybuilder? Like, why am I'm not training to look like, you know, Mark Wahlberg on a movie scene. Like, so why am I using that for my baseball lift? Right. Like it doesn't make sense. Right. And so I love that with the training side is it does need to be specific, but it has been watered down. And I understand that the term, you know, gets used a ton.
Specific doesn't necessarily mean technique. Okay.
Yeah.
Specific to the attractor, specific to the big rocks,
Agreed.
specific to controlling a hinge, specific to closing the front of the pelvis, specific to
Yes.
rotating the torso, specific to getting the shoulder in the socket and finding an isometric co-contraction,
Yes.
specific to deceleration patterns,
Agreed.
but not specific to the skill.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Attractors are universal to every movement in sport, these
Yep.
big rocks. And you can dial in on specificity if you ignore the technique.
Yep.
Attractors transfer.
Yes.
Technique that attractors transfer to every movement. And so that's why our hitters and throwers, it's basically the same workout. You know, in the gym, there's no difference. Okay. And they're training the big rocks really. And the cool thing about that is when you don't like, one of the problems in teaching someone to throw or hit over the course of history is that you just can't throw or hit enough to get good at it.
Yeah.
Right?
Agreed.
I can't rep it up. I can't hit enough to get good at it. Right.
Yeah.
It's all trial and error. But when you zoom out, you worry about these attractors now. I can train the capacity to find a hip lock and to find a hip hinge and to close my pelvis and to rotate my trunk.
Yeah.
I can train that and that will transfer. So when you lock in on training the big rocks, for the first time ever, you can get better at throwing and hitting without having to throw and hit.
Yeah.
You know,
Which is always also to an argument that some people like, whatever happened to throwing and hitting? It's like, no. Well, we do a lot of it. Right. But like you said, right.
You do that.
Yeah. Like, and also hitting, for example, right. I start getting tired, right? The it gets fatigued. You know, again, it can't fire the same. The CNS is fried, you know, all the things, right? And so now I start compensating one more. And now it's like, now you're, you know, you're the patterning and all the things that, you know, you're doing from that side. And like, again, you start finding all of these other ways. And now, again, there could be some pluses to some of that as well. But what you said is like, as well, it's like without putting the body at risk, right? And also to where it's not so fine tuned. Like I said, I can get better at hitting without needing to be in the box, hitting a ball that's actually flying at me, you know?
Right. And now we amplify our return on training time.
Yes.
That's how we get better. We all have 86,400 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm going to be better than you, my 86,400 need to be more productive than yours. A return on training, just like return on investment.
Yep.
I need to be making sure that this thing is helping me get better at the performance outcome that I want.
Yeah.
And in the weight room, to bring it full circle, there's a point at which there's no longer return on training time.
Yeah.
And I don't have, the best I can do is waste my time. The worst I can do is get hurt.
Yeah. I know that you've seen this too. I people would be shocked how many all-stars, specifically hitters, how many all-star hitters that don't lift for 9 months. Literally, and I'm not saying that that's what they should do. But what I am saying is that a lot of people that are like weight room, weight room, weight room, weight room, weight room. And I'm like, dude, this guy right now hasn't lifted a weight in 8 months. Now, again, doesn't mean he hasn't had load, right? He plays every day. He plays every day. He does his water bag stuff, or he does what, or again, he's doing these drills that are putting a load on the body every day. He's in a specimen, right? This guy's a specimen. Like he is, if you looked at him on TV, you wouldn't be able to tell he hasn't lifted a weight. Like he looks the part, he does all the things, but, and also too, he's at a different stage in his development and training. I'm not saying that you should do that at 14, but what I am saying along with it is that, like you said, it points to another direction of what load actually is and how training actually is seen. And again, when I'm playing 162 games and I have 3 days off this entire month, and I'm not a pitcher where I don't have all these days, and I'm hitting every day, and I'm playing shortstop or third base every day, fielding ground balls, taking ground balls before the game, doing all, like all of these things, like, well, that is like load. That's also load on the body that, look, they're doing things that me and you aren't doing, right? Like I'm not taking ground balls every day. I'm not out hitting every single day. I'm not out doing these things. And again, there's a reason why they look the way they look. And, I look the way that I look when I'm trying to get my, my 20 minutes of water bag work in today or whatever,
Yeah.
I think it's big, but,
we had a kid, probably 2016, maybe 17. He came to us, he'd been in college, and he had 2 herniated discs from the weight room, just deadlifts and squats, just trying to do a deadlift with too much herniated disc. And then he tore a labrum. And so he came to us, he had 10 weeks to get
shoulder or hip?
Shoulder, sorry.
Shoulder.
Yeah.
Same.
Great
It sounds like me, Randy. This sounds like me. You're hitting me on the nose here.
And so he came to us, and he actually stayed with us for 12 weeks that summer. I said, listen, you're not going to be able to do a lot of stuff in the weight room. We're going to go all water, all instability loads. Every lift you do, everything you do is going to be water. Well, it turns out that when instability is the load and you use co-contractions, muscles can now force share because there's no slack in the system. They can work. And so instead of having a single muscle pull, we have a whole team of mules pulling the plow, not just one, right?
Yeah.
And so it amplifies ability to produce power, so power control, coordination, and protection, taking the slack out through co-contractions, does all that. So this kid did this for 12 weeks. He went to school. It was his 3rd or 4th school, and got there the first day. He called me up because, Randy, you're not gonna believe this. First day, strength coach says we have to do 1 rep max deadlifts and squats and bench press. He goes, Randy, I haven't lifted a weight in 12 weeks. I outlifted everyone on the team. Because my muscles were able to coordinate and force share.
Yeah, I different version of that and along with it, but I remember on the same side of that, I used to never bench press. You remember back in the time, it was like when you're pitching, like nobody bench press, right? So I would
One
bench
guy got
press.
hurt.
Yeah, right. But I used to do a bunch of push-ups. I would do a ton of push-ups and all those other things. And I remember the same thing. We like maxed one day, and I was like, wow, like how much weight that I did. And again, I'm not saying obviously in that direct line, it's like, again, while you definitely still have the load, and again, like of doing a push-up, like I'm not pressing 225 pounds, right? Which is like where I, that day, like when I maxed or whatever, like I hit, right? But I never bench press, right? Now, again, it's not to say, and again, obviously even different when you have water bags and like you talked about how I'm able to coordinate my whole body. But what I wanted, again, to point back to is there's a lot of ways of training that don't need maximum load or maximum weight specifically, and sub-maximal loads at speed, and like you said, that force, and that's why I always say with water bags, right? It's like the faster you get, the more difficult they are. It makes it harder. The faster I move, the more the water slams, and the more the perturbation is, and the more stability I need, which is almost like being on the field. The faster I move, the more force I create, the more I got to stabilize. I tell people that with like ratio wise with we talk about like engine and brakes, right? It's like when we measure all these things in a weight room, we go the eccentrics. Well, your eccentrics should be 2 to 3 times, generally if we, look at, textbooks, yada, yada, yada. But also too, we look we look at ground force data, we look at kinematics, we look at all these other things. It's like, well, most elite athletes in the world don't just accelerate the quickest. Well, they also decelerate the quickest, right? And their ability to slam on the brakes. And then also too, if you get into some of the eccentric portions and all those things, is like, they don't just have bicycle, like they don't have a Ferrari engine with bicycle brakes. They got a Ferrari engine with, there's special brakes for a Ferrari. There's special brakes for a bus. They don't have the same things that this Toyota Corolla outside, because the car is meant to go at a really high rate of speed, and the bus has a lot of mass that it has to be able to stop, when it's going into a stoplight or, with it as well. And so, I think that, like you said, is that's the one cool thing about water bags. When you program, it's like, dude, it could be the same exercise with the same amount of water in the bag, but today is harder than yesterday. And 3 weeks from now, it's harder than that day because I can do this movement faster now. And then as I do this movement, it makes it harder to stabilize the load that I've now been a part of making, which is very much so like being on the field.
It's really good. One of the arguments against water bags, there's no progressive overload, right? Progressive overload. Right?
Yeah.
Well, if I'm able to move it faster, every time I move faster, I'm progressing the load. So,
yeah. From rep to rep. And as you mentioned, we do sometimes, we have water bags that are a little bit less water. We have water bags that are a little bit more water. Now, like you said, the biggest progressive overload is me moving the implement and how quickly I'm doing that. And also too, the other argument I would say also too, Randy, is the exercise I'm having them do, right?
The complexity of the exercise,
I'm progressing. I'm making it more difficult. I'm making, instead of me having you, I can make this more dynamic. I can make this more where I put your body towards those in ranges where you're not as stable, or and build some stability towards the outer portions, like you said, away from optimal length, right? And I think, and again, because you're doing submaximal loads, you don't have to worry so much about, you could never do that with a barbell. You could never do that with a different type of weight. It's too much. It would be too much.
And the options are infinite. You can move in an infinite number of planes and positions, right?
Agreed.
I think I tweeted
through one movement, not just not individualized, but I can go, I can be hitting frontal, sagittal, right? And also everything in between of the planes that we've defined, right? But yeah.
When I started looking into the anatomy of this new book I was writing, I thought, okay, the pelvis moves in 3 planes, right? First, frontal and sagittal. And then the torso moves in the same 3 planes, right? But like, let's say you start frontal plane first, then you add sagittal, and then you add transverse. Or you could go frontal, sagittal, frontal, transverse, sagittal. You could go in any order you want, right?
Yeah. And
then you connect that to the torso again, move in 3 different directions. You can start with either one.
Yep.
And you have to link that to the pelvis, right? Which goes in its 3 directions. And when you do the permutations of that, there's 730 different possible ways that it can move. Combination. Yeah, we're gonna train it in the gym in one plane, right? Now that's if you assume that we only move in the true 3 planes, but we move in derivative, and there's actually infinite number of it's crazy that we think that the only way to do it is to move in one plane of motion with a metal bar on my back.
Yeah.
So I got to be able to create load, progressive overload, without having to add weight to the bar, because I can only move that in rigid planes. And so, like you said, it's not that you don't lift, of course, a little. I mean, even a lot, right? And everybody's a little different. How much is too much? I don't know.
Yeah.
Every guy's quite different there. But we have to go beyond thinking that the only way to add progressive load is by adding weight to the bar.
Yeah. There's other ways of adding complexity
Yeah.
or stress or stimulus or other
Right.
things, obviously, other than just weight. That's only one way. It's only one dimensional of actually challenging the body, which is obviously not. And again, if my task and my performance is I'm a Olympic weightlifter, okay, but like I obviously am being asked to be measured in performance in much different ways. And then I also look at that, for example, one of the reasons that I really like the logs that we just came out with, and the reason we were training with them, which again, if you're not familiar with that, just think of it more as a Viper, which is like a big tube. It's rubber, it has handles, all those things, right? One of the things that it was designed after from the very get-go was the guys that were the creators. He was talking about like, hey, back in the day, you know, baseball guys and all these guys, like the guys that were really strong in their sport and all these things were like, you know, they lifted hay, you know, they were farmers' kids, or they were construction workers with sledgehammers, and they were, you know, these tasks that we do every single day. And the thing with it, right, is like if you're picking up hay, or you're picking watermelons and you're throwing them onto the truck, or you're throwing a sledgehammer, or doing these things, you know, for all these repetitions over and over again, right? You have all these like awkward loads, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not symmetrical, right? Like it's heavier way over here. And you know, the sledgehammer, it's the load's really towards the end of the object. So as you're swinging it, it's this weird, awkward weight that, you know, it's not a barbell. It's not symmetrical with a 45 on each side. And, you know, you just, the body is just building this symmetrical strength, right? And I really like that, like you said, right? Like we're targeting, you know, fascial system, not only the planes of motions I got to be able to do, but also too, and especially where it mixed with me with like martial arts, I got to be able to hit guys from really weird angles with really tight time frames. I might only be 6 inches from this guy's face, and I got to be able to pop, you know, I got to be able to hit him with some force in a very small window of time from an awkward position where I'm in this really compromised position, but I got to be able to create enough power where I could pop his head back and then hit him with an actual powerful punch or whatever, right? And it reminded me of the motion like you talked about of pitching or hitting, right? Where I might start off weird, I might be in a compromised position, but how can I use that compromised position? Do I have enough strength to get me to a position of leverage where I can get off the next strike, quote unquote? Yeah. And that's where, you know, like you said, how it transfers is like, I posted this motion yesterday where, you know, I'm holding it by these handles, and I'm kind of doing like a rowing motion as I'm walking, and I'm working reciprocal, right? And then at the end, you know, I throw like, you know, an uppercut or like a powerful like strike at the end. And, you know, again, along with it, right? Like, could you also progress that into water bags and other things? Because I'll also argue this, some things where people think water bags aren't that tough, I'll give you some exercises where with a water bag, it's almost impossible, right? Because, and what I mean by that is that perturbation makes it so difficult, right? Like you can't do it yet. We might have to progress to a water bag because a water bag is too unstable for the system to be able to hold, right? So that's another argument for like it not being tough.
You have to add variability or instability, just like you add weight to the bar. You have to add it gradually. You don't just put, you know, 3 plates on the bar. You gradually, right? Yeah, and being able to find stability when things are not in optimal positions is athleticism.
Yes, agreed, 100%.
And this is this thing we recognize as athleticism. I was in a compromised position. I didn't fall over. I was able to catch myself and find stability.
Yep.
Right. It's everything. And so it always fascinates me too how, I mean, I love teaching hitting as much as I love in talking hitting. You know, because it's the same movement, right? Like you think about one of the things we talk about all the time is stopping the pelvis from rotating in the transverse plane, right? We think of it having a back door and a front door. So I'll pull the pelvis out.
Yeah. Grab your pelvis, Randy. We've almost gone the whole conversation without grabbing the pelvis.
I didn't have a pelvis.
Yeah, what are we doing?
Back door and front door for a right-hander, right?
I'm gonna get my pelvis too, so we can both have.
Go ahead.
All All right.
Okay, awkward.
All right.
Awkward. We're sharing. Okay, so you got to be able to stop it from spinning this way, right?
Yep.
As a pitcher and a hitter. As a pitcher, if I'm not able to stop the front of my pelvis from spinning, I'm going to peel off and I'm going to let go of the ball almost behind my head, and
Yep.
I'll miss arm side high, and then I'll overcompensate and spike balls glove side low because I'm on the merry-go-round.
Yep.
Right? And so many pitchers think you have to get on the merry-go-round early, and they start and they're rotating this way, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think of it as flatbed truck and then merry-go-round. You don't have to start rotating until your front foot hits the ground,
Yep.
right? And now we can get to what I call authentic extension, where the pelvis stops, the trunk rotates out, and I release the ball out here. My command is better. I'm healthier. My secondary stuff, I can't make a breaking ball go down and before it pops up if I let go back here.
Mm-hmm.
It has to, I have to stop. And it's the same in hitting, right? In hitting, if I don't stop the pelvis, I'll never have authentic opposite field power.
Amen.
I'll hit mile long foul balls in the parking lot, and
Yep.
I'll hit flippers to
Hey,
opposite field, right?
listen, Randy, we don't need to bring up my hitting career, okay? Thank
Me
you.
too. Me too. The only doubles I got peeled off into the bullpen. They had to go into the bullpen. I led the nation in singles, right? Right. 352 lifetime, by the way.
Hey,
All singles.
my guy.
All
All
That's
singles.
my approach. It was. I had like 7 homers, 2 doubles, and all singles. And my approach to hitting in college was just try not to make an out.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
anyway, but if I learn to stop the pelvis, now I can get out here and get those pitches out in front of the plate and hit balls with authentic power opposite field
Agreed.
as opposed to plan. And that fascinates me. And those two movements are so similar, right? The
Yep.
only difference is that my bandwidth of variability as a pitcher is very narrow. So I
Yep.
don't need a ton of on the edge work as a pitcher. But
Yep.
on a hitter, man, I'm going to be in compromised positions.
Yep.
As a Muay Thai fighter, I'm
Striker.
going to
Yeah,
a
I would
lot-
say any type of striking sport where you're
Yeah.
reactive, as Bosch was talking about, right? Like as you're reactive, you don't have time for the co-contractions become so vital because you don't have
Right.
time to pull it out through counter movements as much.
Exactly. And you're going to be in really compromised positions
Yep.
and have to fight through it with a guy your weight leaning on you and trying to get you up,
Yep.
And so in pitching, the variability needs to be less. I don't have to work so far. In hitting, man, we spend a lot of time with our hitters working on the edges. Like, I need you to find stability when you're completely fooled by this raking ball and you're about to fall over. Okay. I need you to do the water bags out here and over here and in these awkward compromised positions. And
Yep.
it just fascinates me how those two movements, when you ignore the technique, are the same.
Yeah.
They're the-
And
Then-
I would definitely say that generally, like pelvis wise too, as well, more where I would say like pitchings, I would more expect it to be, again, I was like, I'm coming over the front side. We're like hitting, I'm going to be more like rotating in my pelvis going to be a little bit, but again, generally the overall.
orientation is the same, but the body parts all have to work together the same manner, right?
Yeah.
It's just-
Yeah.
And you're basically trying to work with muscles at optimal lengths.
Yes. And like, as you talked about specifically, like too, as well as like, we do it all the time. We have hitters swing the water bag with a ball shooting at them. Right. And they're not hitting the ball, but they're using it, right? Like if it's moving and they're having to time it, right? You have something that's already moving. And then also too, now you swing it, great. You generated all this force, but that water, like because of the kinetic sequence, like the water actually hits the end of the water bag, right? And then you have a perturbation at the end, and I got to be able to decelerate and stop that force that I've now created. And I think, like you talk about too as well, is like, and we've mentioned one of the biggest deficits I've found hitting wise with as we've done all of our evaluations with novice hitters compared to like expert, or elite hitters, is been I've found a lot of people that can and again, specifically in our niche, right? I found a lot of people that have learned to rotate hard,
Mhm,
but
mhm.
but what they have an issue with is also, cracking the whip, right? Closing the front side, like all those other things. And also some of that is because of the intention, like you said earlier, is they're really trying to rotate. They're trying to create, they want more time to get up to speed, and they're trying to
Yeah.
reach a higher level of speed in a longer window of time. And because they need a longer window of time to get up to speed, I gave somebody this example the other day. I said, okay, hey, let's say we were racing, right? And we're going to get past this finish line, but 4 feet after the finish line, there's a cliff, and we're going to fall off the cliff and go down. Now, if we go to sprint and I'm faster than you. I'm much higher, like higher top speed than you. But the difference is you got better brakes than I do. You can stop, right?
Mhm.
So what happens is I don't have really good brakes, but I have a really high top speed. Well, I can't even use my full engine because I can't stop. So
I got
I
slow
have,
transportation.
yeah, so I have to back off what my maximum capacity is. And you can run at full speed because you can stop on a dime when you need to, right? Where I have to start braking way earlier than you have to brake because I literally can't stop. So I was like, you want to use the full engine and the capacity that you have, we got to be able to, again, build on the brake side, right? Or the stability side and all these things to stop that amount of force that you're capable of creating. And in most circumstances, especially hitting, is I can get in there and just rotate fast, just rotate really fast all the time. But and it's so easy to build up that part of it without having the secondary part. And that's why for a lot of times when we get our athletes that come in, our younger athletes, we got to build the engine too, of course, right? They do need to learn how to rotate hard. But a lot of our pro guys, they don't have a rotating fast problem. Like they most of them wouldn't be there, right? Majority, if not all, wouldn't be there if they couldn't rotate fast in the first place. But that becomes a much more low hanging fruit thing for them, is like, hey, let's be able to access that capacity that you already have, that you can't access because you don't have the ability, like you said, to close the door and actually like get it into the ball. Or again, when you're swinging, actually transfer that energy actually into your barrel, and you're not using your body like a tow rope. You're using it like a rubber band,
Yeah.
you know?
And pitching is a little bit longer, low intensity phase than hitting, right? And so learning to rotate fast without a counter movement, a pitcher can use a little bit of a counter movement, but a hitter doesn't have time to learn to build up and he has to be able to do the 1-inch punch. He cannot depend on counter movements to take slack out, to be able to rotate fast. He has to use corrections to make it happen. So it's a little different in that regard, is that in pitching, our low intensity phase is a little longer than yours, right?
Mhm.
And it's not, I don't have to react to the ball
Yeah.
and make an adjustment. Like I used to have to react to the information I'm gathering from my body, not all the environment, right?
Yeah.
And so,
And obviously the other thing with that too, right, is the hitters can't see the ball actually hit the bat, right? It's going too fast. So they
Right.
have to make a projection of where they're
Yep.
guessing where the ball's going to be when they
Mhm.
do swing. Right.
Right.
So for the last like 15 or 20 feet, they can't, your brain can't process it, send it to your body and do that in that period of time. So your brain's projecting. And so that's also the other thing, right? If I do a move that's longer, that takes longer to get up to speed, which means I now have to commit super early, right? Now I make worse, like when everybody gets on like swing decisions. Okay, we're gonna train all these swing decisions. And I'm like, well, yeah, but the movement, right? How your body has been trained to move forces it to have to make decisions far earlier than my movement does, right? And what I mean by that is like the co-contractions, all those things, right? Like if I can be more late and sudden, but you have to decide, and again, we're talking about 0.2 of a second sooner than 0.2 of a second in hitting is a really long time, right? With the ball in the air. So, again, the best eye study that I've seen was like they increased by like 6 inches of ball flight or something like that, of being able to like track the, train the brain to perceive it better. Where I've always found, like, again, like you said, training the body to be able to co-contract and be able to wait longer, right, is way more than necessarily training the brain to have a better reaction time when that guy's already an elite hitter that has an elite reaction time already, and you're trying to move the needle rather than, you know, again, training the body to give the brain and the problem solving unit up here more options, right, and longer to make decisions.
Well, I would even suggest that I kind of think that there is no decision that is made. There's no such thing as a swing decision.
Mhm.
It's your body. If you can find stability wherever you are, your body will hit the ball. You're afforded that pitch, right? That pitch is okay. This idea of perception and movement being linked, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the better you move, so it's called affordances. James J. Gibson called it affordances is an invitation to move. Okay. So like if I'm Barry Sanders and I put my foot in the ground and I see a hole between two defenders this big, I'm the most agile athlete to ever play football. I'm afforded that hole. That is an option for me. Okay, I can get through that. If I'm Randy Sullivan and you pitch me the ball and I see the same hole, I don't move like Barry Sanders. I'm not afforded that hole. I'm going to need a bigger hole.
Yeah.
And it's not that I put my foot in the ground and go, I can't get through that hole. It never presents itself as
An option.
get throughable. That hole is not get throughable. Okay.
Yeah.
The better I move, the more pitches present themselves as hittable. I take a pitch not either because I had a preconceived intent, a predetermined intent to take,
Yeah.
or because my body doesn't perceive that pitch as hittable because I don't move well enough to hit it.
Yeah.
And so if I can expand the affordances by increasing the movement ability, like the ability to find stability on the edges, now more pitches will present themselves as hittable. And I don't have to worry about decisions because I can get this one, I can get this one because I can find stability even when I'm not perfect, right?
Mhm.
So late and sudden is good.
Yeah.
Adaptability is good. I think they're linked, right?
Yeah.
I think that okay, let's talk about the pelvis and the kickback swing, okay?
Mhm.
The false rotation.
Yeah.
Okay, agility, and this is from Bosch's book, there's in a tight turn, there's two ways to rotate. You can rotate with true rotation, which is hips and shoulders go in the same direction.
Mhm.
Okay, that's sort of Donaldson swing, hips and
Yep.
shoulders go in the same direction. But in an emergency situation, you can use a false rotation, which is the hips and shoulders go opposite directions, right?
Mhm.
So Dak Prescott working on his, this move, that's a false rotation. There are times when he needs that in an emergency, the pocket's collapsing, got to get to the outlet, boom. I don't have time for this, right?
Mhm.
So, and that's a false rotation where the pelvis and it's like wringing a towel.
Yeah.
Pelvis, torso, and shoulders are going opposite directions.
Yeah.
In hitting, but I promise you, if Dak Prescott has a clean pocket and a guy open 40, 30 yards down the field on a skinny post, he's going hips, then shoulders.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
not doing that, right?
Agreed.
And so, and you need both in your tool belt. You need both, right?
Yeah.
And so for us, the true rotation swing happens when I'm early and on time, and there's not a lot of I'm not pressed for time here. I'm not fooled.
Mhm.
Then I can go hips and shoulders, but I also can go ahead and make a kickback swing and make the pelvis and shoulders go opposite directions. Now, I think that gives us the late and sudden component. That allows me to be late and sudden because I can wait the last second and still find stability. I don't have to be early and on time as I do in the swing.
And as you talked about too, right? As you go up the chain of better and better people that you're competing against, right? When I'm facing a guy throwing 98 and he can do all the other things, right? Like as you know, as a pitcher, right? Like if my fastball is more plus, it makes my secondary stuff 10 times better, right? Like when Chapman first came in the league, right? Bro, you're throwing 105, your slider can be okay, right? Like, but as if you throw, again, if you're only throwing 91 and you got an okay slider, right? Like that, again, it's not going to play as well. So that's where I also think as well, right? Is like, again, because we have to predict where the ball is going to go. And also because at the highest levels of the game, we're typically not on time. Well, like I ask people like throughout the season, how often are you perfectly on time? And they're like, like almost never, like if ever, right? And even when I hit a ball, like great, it's like, is that your best swing that you've ever taken, like perfectly on time? It's just like, no, like it could have been, this could have been a little better, this could have been a little better, that could have been a little better, right? And it's like, yeah, so that's where I also, for example, and also too, for as you mentioned, right? Just because the foot doesn't go behind me doesn't mean that I'm not getting a false rotation or a kick, right? Like the foot doesn't actually have to go behind me, right?
Right.
And so I see that a lot too, because even in those guys that do true rotation, right? If you look at I don't know if you've seen this, but years ago they did a sports science segment on Rory McIlroy, right? And they were talking about measuring his pelvis, right? And they're like, yo, he does this amazing thing, right? It rotates, right? But then also too, as he gets into contact, his pelvis counter rotates harder than amateurs rotate forward. But then they go, but that's not why he hits the ball so hard. And I'm like, like, I don't know. Right. He's a smaller guy that has one of the longest drives, that has one of the, all these things, like the efficiency with it. And one of the things I also think about too is just like, if you go into, like you talked about, is like, it's like a boat, right? Okay. If you've ever driven a boat, there's basically 3 ways that you can stop the boat, right? I can the water resistance and like, kill the engine, let the water slow me down, right?
Yeah.
I can drop the anchor and slow down the boat that way, or I can put the boat in reverse, right? Now, even though I put the boat in reverse, it's still going forward, right? But when it finally stops, it's going to actually go in reverse, right? And so like our bodies don't really have brakes, like that's something we give it. But in reality, we have counter forces, right? And so if you look at that, right, athletes, like when we measure that and we sync it up with video and you have a high enough frame rate and all the things, you can see not only does the pelvis counter rotate. Before I used to see it back in the day, I would see the pelvis counter rotate, or I didn't see the pelvis counter rotate. The cameras weren't good enough. I just saw this like hesitation in the pelvis and I'm like, what is that? Right. And then we watch it in slow-mo and it actually counters and then finishes rotation. Right. And so when I look at that, it's like, and then we actually measure that with, obviously force plate data and then get the kinematics. Well, it's like, when elite athletes, when they're like 30 degrees into their turn, they're already at max speed with their pelvis, right? And this is the finish line. This is the finish line. We're talking about running off the cliff. If I have to keep running to get the speed that I actually need with my pelvis, right? Because I have that rolling hill type, move, then I have to rotate longer before I can actually stop. Well, then that delays the transfer of energy, also up the body, right? So our elite hitters, it's like from right here, it's at maximum speed, like 30 degrees into the turn. And yes, the hips keep rotating into contact, but they're decelerating as they're rotating into contact. And then when they finally stop at contact, the hips counter and then it finishes rotation, And so even when I look at that, like you talked about, right? Even if you grab a guy like Donaldson or some of these things, and I would even say that, right, with like Donaldson was a big guy that used a ton of speed and athleticism to hit, right? It wasn't the most efficient. Like if you measured, on the other side of that, like, don't get me wrong, is it more efficient than, the average? Of course, right? Like way more efficient than the average person. But when it came to longevity over a career, I feel like why his career kind of fell off a cliff. What happens is when you lose athleticism and we're using that athleticism to hit and create these massive speeds for these inefficiencies of how well you transferred force up your body. I see those guys, their careers tend to fall off a cliff because soon as you have injuries, you get older, you get all these other things. It's like, well, now efficiency becomes a major indicator for you. And I know you obviously have some personal experience, but when it comes to somebody like Verlander or some of these guys that have pitched for so long, it's like, well, obviously he's not the athlete he used to be. Obviously he's aged. Obviously he's done all these other things, but he can still throw, right, at high rates of speed and he could still transfer energy super well. He's still really efficient. his longevity of his career. And now when you look at that, instead of looking at it like peak performance, but when you look at it like, yo, how long do I want to play this game, and how much money do I want to make over, a tenure of this career, is that can work and be also a major leap for you as well. Is like, man, if my efficiency really goes up, I can play this game for a lot longer period of time. Where,
Right.
like Donaldson, for example, because of how he was creating speed and those other things, my, again, personal opinion with the injuries and the other things is he now had to commit so early to fastballs that it
Right.
left him so exposed to, as he aged, it made it worse and worse and worse. And then like your performance cliff, like, he really fell off, even though he was an MVP. He was a really good, and again, there was years there where he was elite, right? But I also see that as well, like you talked about, right? It's like, sometimes I tell people all the time, it's like, again, people see the foot working behind you and they think that like, oh, that's a scissor, it's a move, it's a whatever. And I'm like, no, like this other guy is scissoring under the hood, is as Tewksbury would talk about it, right? Like you're scissoring under the hood, even though you don't see the foot working behind, but you can see the actions of the pelvis and what the pelvis is actually doing,
Yeah. And pitchers will do the same thing. That, like, some of them will pimp the finish, right? And some of them will, but they're still, the pelvis is stopping and counter rotating.
Yeah. The roots and meats and potato is still there, right? That the aesthetic
They're both false rotations, even though, and the danger, I think, of chasing the pimp is when I dug in deep into the evolution of throwing, right? And in this new book, and I found, why are we so much better at throwing than apes, right? Because our pecs and lats have developed better, right? And so what happens is, when we get to full extension of the arm, there's a big article, a really good article. We get to extension of the arm, the pecs and lats go into isometric co-contraction, and now we're depending on isoelastic energy, okay? And it's actually the trunk rotation that advances the ball forward. The arm, actually, when we look at the top, it never comes forward like this. It's trunk rotation, but you have to be in an isometric, isoelastic state, right?
Yeah.
And you can't be in isometric and concentric at the same time. It's impossible, right? And so when we teach guys to pimp the finish, if they don't do it right, if they just try to move their arm forward, they breach that divide.
Yeah.
So it happens organically, but it's a result of what's happening in the pelvis with the counter rotation.
Agreed.
And the arm is just a byproduct of that.
Yeah.
But keep it in the isoelastic state. When it'll bounce back. But the actual pimp job comes because you really counter rotate.
You can't, Bregman one time did a conversation where he was talking about, like, you can't pimp it unless you do a lot of things really well.
Right.
And when guys pimp it, so I'll even do that as like a destination cue with guys sometimes, right? Like, as you're saying that, right? Like, hey, I want you to pimp every ball you hit this whole round, right? And so I think of it like the GPS system, right? When I give it a destination, it figures out a route, and there's multiple routes of how to get there, right? Right. But like, hey, like, I'm giving you, try to get to this, or, for example, like, we have a bunch of different drills. We got Trouts and Correas and Bregmans, and they all do this little different variations of what they do at the end of their movement. But we found it so much where, like, when I cue guys and I give them a destination or an endpoint, right? And again, it doesn't mean that their swing's actually going to be like this, but it helps them organize and create a more take away some other options, right? Of other things, like, man, if I spin, you're right. Like, I have no chance at pimping the finish, or if I blow out my front side, like, right. There's no way I could never do that. Right. And so that could be also a really useful way of doing that. And I really love that. And which is also, like, constraints are the same way, right? Like, when we utilize constraints, we're trying to take away options and organize, you have to self-organize within those constraints to complete the task, and it becomes super useful.
When it occurs, it's great.
Yes.
But there's also a way to get there the wrong way.
Correct.
It's like rotation, like rotating fast. There's a way to rotate fast wrong, right?
Yeah.
Hip to shoulder separation, if you will. There's a way to do it well and then a way not to do it well.
Yes,
Right.
100%. And you know, I always say this with okay, so if a guy gets in the squat, there would be, for example, there's like really compromised positions where you'd be like, hey, I'm not going to load that up. I'm not going to just keep slapping weight on the bar. Like this guy's going to hurt his back. He's going to herniate a disc. He's going to do these other things, right? But then we look at rotation and we look at the transverse plane. I think a lot of strength coaches, because one, they try to avoid the transverse plane because there's going to be a lot of injuries and there's a lot of need and demand from different joints in the body to complete the task. So a lot of times they stay very sagittal and frontal when they're in the weight room. It's also very a lot easier to load those things when I have a barbell. Well, training transverse is not the most optimal. And then so I just give them med ball and I tell them throw it against the wall as hard as you can. And it's like, well, but here's the difference though. There's also bad rotation, right? There's not just, you know, there's bad squats, right? There's bad forms that like you can put your body in a compromised position, but there's also specifically as well, like if a guy goes to throw a med ball and he's yanking his shoulder, right? And he's spinning his lower half and he's dragging the ball and then he's throwing it. It's like, well, yeah, if I measure at the wall, did he create some force? Yeah, absolutely. Of course he created some force, but also at the same time, how he went about creating that force matters. And that's why I think, you know, even too, we've found that too as well. And I think that, you know, this been the space where it's been putting out like, oh, like bat speed, rotate hard, right? Like all these things. It's like, well, yeah, but this is the problem. It's like, again, that guy does rotate that hard, but he doesn't rotate that hard that way, right? Like there is compromised positions, obviously, and compromised ways of trying to create that same end result, as you mentioned, right? There is bad super compensations that I can create. And typically, especially if there's a hardware issue, right? There can be some, you know, really bad compensations that are stacked on top of poor movement. Like if I really lack some true IR in my front hip, like the body's going to find a way to do what I ask it to do.
It'll do somewhere else. Yeah, it'll do it somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah. So no, yeah, I think that's good. But no, yeah, Randy, I appreciate too. I know we end up doing a longer segment. I figured it was going to be a little bit longer.
It's fun. It's fun.
Yeah.
My computer actually died. I had to go plug it in.
I had to go plug it in. Yeah, it's going good. No, yeah, no, I appreciate it. I think it'd be good too as well. I'm sure. I thought I was shocked that we haven't done one all the way to this point. Like we have such good conversations all the time. But yeah, no, always appreciate all the things also too, like, you know, it came to like water bags and all this stuff. I know it's all the rave and all the stuff now, but again, like originally when Wes, you know, came over from your guys' shop and came over when I was over at 108 and, you know, again, we started doing water bags. Like that was a big intro to me and I also had some of those same questions and the things we talked about, like, well, you know, and I only knew about loading up the bar and like, you know, it's the stability that's needed and all these things. And so we've always, me and Wes have built a great relationship and I've, you know, also really appreciated, you know, your work and also too, you know, in our field too, it's like when you can find someone that's deep enough to appreciate what you do from all the intricacies and what you've built and what you continue to share and also how it pushes the game of baseball together forward in general, I've always really appreciated. So no, yes, you know, again, really appreciate you jumping on and sharing your knowledge also too with, you know, avid baseball learners and, you know, they're going to get on here and be like, man, I didn't know they're Randy over there talking hitting, talking body movements, all the things like, me and Randy do this constantly all the time.
It was a good time, man. I'm surprised we never did it, you know, like this. So that's cool. We'll do it again. That's awesome, man. Thanks for inviting me. I had a great time. I've liked you since I met you. You're a cool dude. And there's, you know, this game is it's a small circle. And when you make good friends, those relationships last forever, bro. So
yeah,
thanks.
I love it. And then Randy, also too, some big ones that are across the board, right? The skill acquisition summit.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah. Can you give everybody kind of a rundown on what that is?
Yeah, we took this skill acquisition science to a new level and applied it to baseball like no one ever has before. We call it the Baseball Skill Acquisition Summit. It's basically using these concepts that we discussed throughout the day to optimize our training to help improve performance in high-level athletes. And so we've hosted this thing with our friends from the Netherlands, Frans Bosch, Martijn Nijhoff, Bart Hanegraaff. Alan Cole will be there. He's our performance director here. and Rob Gray from Perception Action Podcast and
great.
Real Estate University. And we basically take this skill acquisition science and apply it. And we funnel from a lot of talk about theory on the first day and then funnel it down into practical application. By the end of the day, we hope that all the coaches are empowered with the tools to go back and transform their player development process and integrate these ideas. And it is this year, it's our 6th one that we've done. We'd skip one for COVID year, but it is on October 19th and 20th here in Lakeland. And anyone can look into signing up for it at FloridaBaseballArmory.com/summit. And it'll be a pretty neat experience. And we got, and every year we kind of just advance the content and take the bar a little higher and take it. And, you know, we've been attended by 29 of the 30 major league teams have come with multiple representatives.
Number 30 needs to figure it out, huh?
I'm not gonna say what it is, but you know, they haven't won in a while. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun to be around good people, and you know, the content is one thing and the presentation is one thing. The hashing things out, you know, around the coffee bar and everything else afterwards is really cool. It's just a lot of high level thinkers exchanging ideas, and then also not just sitting in an ivory tower and talking theory, but funneling it down to practical application things that people can use every day.
Yeah,
pretty cool. So
love it. And then also too, Randy, I know that you're a avid writer. I know some of the books are right behind you right now too as well. Point out some of the resources that you've made over the years too as well.
Yeah, well, I've written this last book that I wrote was the 10th one. It's sort of almost ready for publication. We're just putting the illustrations in now. And it's gonna be it's my favorite one so far because Franz Bosch was my editor and he was relentless.
Relentless,
It was
tearing it to pieces.
The first time I ever wrote something, like when you write a book, people go, "Hey, that was a good book." And you're like, "Was it?" Because I don't like it anymore, you know. But nobody really critiques you about it. But he was like really challenged me to dig deeper, and he would, you know, like it's 10 chapters. The first chapter went through 7 revisions. I could send it over to Holland, and he would send it back with steak knives in it. And instead of telling me like to change it, he would go, "You need to go research articles on this and this and this, and then integrate it all into the context of the body." And so so it was really cool to be challenged like that and to force me to take it a step higher, to go, okay, let's dig deeper. And it made us better. And I can't wait for it to come out, but it's called Integrated Anatomy of Pitching. I'm thinking maybe this winter, if we can get through this, getting the pictures all right. Cause there's a lot of pictures in this book, cause it talks a lot about anatomy. So you need to straighten that a lot. But then I wrote a book with Rob Gray last summer, called
I got it.
Baseball Coaching. I wrote another one called Savage Revolution, Overthrowing the Status Quo in Baseball Player Pitcher Development. That's probably the most recent one. The one I like the most. It talks a lot about these concepts that we discussed today. And they can get all those books at FloridaBaseballArmory.com/books. And if anyone's interested in training with us, FloridaBaseballArmory.com, or they can call 866-STRIKE-3, and Amy will take care of it from there. So I appreciate the opportunity.
You should just call just to talk to Amy, honestly, you know?
Call Amy. Honestly, that's what you gotta do.
Yeah, just
You text me, "Hey, do you want me to have Taylor get a hold of Amy and set this on me yet?" Because I never even know what time of day it is. So
no. It's so funny because you have always said that. And it's funny because that's what Taylor does for me now. She controls my entire schedule. And then also too, just like I might double book, like, please don't ask me. Like, I don't know the prices for anything. I don't know any of the thing. Like, listen, I'm not the one to talk to. And also too, honestly, if you don't want me sending your stuff out or any of your stuff, like Taylor handles all of that stuff. So she's the best.
That.
So awesome with there too as well. But yeah, no, appreciate it. Thank you so much for, coming on as well. And like I said, I'm sure we'll connect here again soon.
Thanks a lot, Joey. Take care, bud.